Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished teaching her final combat training class of the day. The small gym in downtown Phoenix was quiet now, except for the sound of her students packing up their gear. At 32 years old, Sarah looked like any other fitness instructor to the casual observer. Her shoulder-length brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her athletic build suggested someone who took care of herself, but nothing more extraordinary than that. What her students didn't know was that Sarah had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, leading missions that saved countless lives. Her knowledge of combat tactics, weapons, and survival techniques was beyond what most people could imagine. But Sarah kept that part of her life private. She had left the military 2 years ago after losing her best friend and fellow SEAL, Marcus, in an explosion during their final mission together. The trauma of that day had changed everything for her. The nightmares came regularly, and the guilt of surviving when Marcus didn't eat away at her every day. She moved to Phoenix to start fresh, opening her small self-defense studio called Phoenix Rising. She taught basic martial arts and self-defense to local women, teenagers, and anyone who wanted to learn how to protect themselves. It was her way of giving back, of finding peace in a civilian life that often felt too quiet after years of constant danger. Sarah's reputation in the neighborhood was simple: she was the nice lady who taught people how to throw a proper punch and get out of dangerous situations. Her classes were popular because she had a gentle way of teaching that didn't intimidate beginners. Mothers brought their teenage daughters to learn confidence. College students came to learn basic safety skills. Office workers dropped by after long days to release stress and learn something useful. But trouble had been brewing in the area for months. A new criminal organization had moved into the neighborhood, led by a man named Viktor Kozlov. Viktor was a former Russian military officer who had turned to crime after being discharged for violent behavior. He was smart, ruthless, and had a particular hatred for anyone with military training, especially Americans. His organization dealt in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and protection rackets. Viktor had heard whispers about Sarah's gym and had sent his men to scope it out several times. What he saw was exactly what Sarah wanted him to see: a small, struggling business run by a woman who seemed harmless enough. Her students were mostly women and kids, and the gym looked like it barely made enough money to stay open. To Viktor, it seemed like the perfect place to establish a front operation. The first approach came on a Thursday evening in October. Sarah was cleaning up after her last class when 3 men walked through her front door. They were clearly not there for fitness classes. The leader was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos covering his arms. His companions flanked him on either side, their hands resting casually near concealed weapons. Sarah Martinez, the leader, asked in a thick accent. "My name is Dmitry. I work for someone who is interested in your business." Sarah continued wiping down the mirrors, keeping her voice steady and casual. "I'm not looking for investors right now, thanks." Dmitry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is not about investing. Is about protection. This neighborhood, it can be dangerous place for women running business alone. Many bad things can happen." Sarah turned to face him, recognizing the classic protection racket approach. She had seen it dozens of times in war zones where local strongmen tried to control territory through fear and intimidation. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm doing just fine on my own." "I think you misunderstand," Dmitry said, taking a step closer. "This is not request. Mr. Kozlov, he owns this street now. Every business pays for protection. Is simple business transaction." The 2 other men moved to block the exits, a move that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. Her military training automatically kicked in, and she began calculating distances, angles, and potential weapons within reach. But she forced herself to stay calm and maintain her cover as a simple gym owner. "How much?" she asked quietly. $2,000 per month, Dmitry replied with a satisfied smile. Very reasonable price for such nice place. Sarah knew that amount would bankrupt her small business within 3 months. That was probably the point. When she couldn't pay, they would either force her out or force her to let them use her gym for their illegal activities. She had seen this pattern before. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Dimitri's smile disappeared. "Time for thinking is luxury you cannot afford. You have until tomorrow night to make payment, or we make decision for you." The three men left as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Sarah alone in her gym with a decision to make. She could call the police, but she knew from experience that without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. Victor's organization was probably paying off half the local cops anyway. She could close her gym and move again, but the thought of running from another fight made her stomach turn. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the gym, staring at a photograph of herself and Marcus in their military gear. They were both grinning at the camera, exhausted but victorious after completing a particularly difficult mission. Marcus had always told her that the skills they learned as SEALs weren't just for war zones. They were tools for protecting innocent people wherever they were needed. "What would you do, Marcus?" she whispered to the photograph. The answer came to her clearly: he would fight. Not because he wanted to, but because letting bullies win meant letting innocent people suffer. Sarah thought about her students, especially the young women who came to her classes because they had already been victims of violence or intimidation. If Victor's men took over her gym, what would happen to those women? Where would they go to feel safe and learn to protect themselves? By morning, Sarah had made her decision. She wouldn't run, and she wouldn't pay. But she also wouldn't reveal her true capabilities unless she absolutely had to. Instead, she would let Victor's organization believe they were dealing with an ordinary woman who was simply too stubborn to give up easily. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one, but on her terms. Sarah spent the day preparing. She moved her most vulnerable students' classes to earlier in the week and encouraged them to take a few days off. She secured or removed anything in her gym that could be used as a weapon against her. Most importantly, she began planning multiple scenarios for what was likely to come. That evening, as the sun set over Phoenix, Sarah waited. She had changed from her usual workout clothes into jeans and a simple black t-shirt. To anyone watching, she looked nervous but determined, like a small business owner who had decided to make a stand despite being clearly outmatched. At exactly 8 o'clock, Dimitri returned with 5 men instead of 2. They entered her gym with the confidence of predators who believed their prey was cornered. Sarah was stretching on a yoga mat in the center of the room, seemingly oblivious to the danger walking through her door. "I hope you have made smart decision," Dimitri announced loudly. Sarah stood up slowly, making sure to appear slightly intimidated. "I've thought about your offer," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of nervous defiance. "And my answer is no." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the front door being locked behind the 6 men. Dimitri's expression shifted from confident to annoyed to something much more dangerous. "This is very disappointing," he said, nodding to his men. "But perhaps you will change mind after we show you what happens to people who do not respect Mr. Kozlov's generosity." 2 of his men moved toward Sarah while the others spread out to surround her. In their minds, they were dealing with a stubborn civilian who needed to be taught a lesson. They expected tears, begging, maybe some ineffective flailing before they could intimidate her into compliance. What they got instead was something none of them were prepared for. As the first man reached for Sarah's arm, muscle memory from thousands of hours of combat training took over. Her response was instant and precise. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it in a specific way that caused immediate, debilitating pain, and used his forward momentum to throw him over her shoulder. The man hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of him before he could even process what had happened. The second attacker paused for just a moment, confused by how quickly his partner had gone down. That moment of hesitation cost him dearly. Sarah pivoted and delivered a perfectly placed kick to his knee, dropping him to the ground clutching his leg in agony. The remaining 4 men, including Dimitri, suddenly realized they were not dealing with an ordinary gym owner. But, by then, it was too late for them to adjust their tactics effectively. Sarah had already assessed each of them as threats and had begun moving with the fluid precision that had made her one of the most effective SEALs in her unit.
The next few minutes were a masterclass in close-quarters combat.
Sarah used the layout of her own gym to her advantage, employing techniques that her attackers had never seen before. She moved like water around their clumsy attempts to grab or strike her, always staying one step ahead while methodically dismantling their ability to fight back. When the dust settled, all 6 men were on the ground in various states of consciousness and mobility. None of them were seriously injured, but all of them would be feeling the effects of their encounter with Sarah for weeks to come. She had been careful to use only enough force to neutralize the immediate threat, drawing on her training in non-lethal takedowns. Dimitri, nursing a dislocated shoulder and a bruised ego, looked up at Sarah with a mixture of pain, confusion, and something that might have been respect.
"Who are you?" he gasped.
Sarah looked down at him with calm, steady eyes. "I'm someone who teaches people how to protect themselves. And now you're going to go back to Mr. Kozlov and tell him that my gym is under new management." As the 6 men limped and stumbled out of her gym, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. Viktor Kozlov was not the type of man to accept this kind of defeat quietly. He would want answers about who had embarrassed his men, and, when he learned the truth about Sarah's background, he would come back with everything he had. But, for the first time since Marcus's death, Sarah felt truly alive again. The guilt and trauma that had been weighing her down for 2 years seemed lighter somehow. She had found her purpose again, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And, this time, she would be ready for whatever came next. That night, Sarah called her former commanding officer, Colonel Rebecca Hayes. After explaining the situation, she made a request that surprised even herself. "I need you to help me disappear from military records," she said. "If anyone comes looking for information about Sarah Martinez's service history, I want them to find as little as possible." "That's a big ask, Martinez," the colonel replied. "Why?" "Because I have a feeling this fight is just getting started, and I want to maintain every advantage I can." Colonel Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "You know I can't make your records completely disappear. But I might be able to bury them deep enough that it would take serious resources to find them. That's all I need. Just enough mystery to keep them guessing." After ending the call, Sarah sat in the darkness of her gym, surrounded by the equipment she used to teach people how to defend themselves. Tomorrow, she would go back to being the gentle instructor who helped nervous beginners learn basic self-defense. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, she felt like herself again. She thought about Marcus and the promise they had made to each other during their final mission, that they would never stop fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She had thought that promise died with him in that explosion. But now she realized that it had just been waiting for the right moment to come alive again. Viktor Kozlov had made a critical error in targeting her gym. He thought he was dealing with a vulnerable small business owner. Instead, he had just awakened someone who had spent 8 years learning how to win fights that seemed impossible to win. The war for Phoenix had begun, and Sarah Martinez was ready to teach her most important lesson yet. The next morning brought an eerie calm to Sarah's neighborhood. As she unlocked her gym and began preparing for her early morning classes, she noticed the subtle changes that most people would miss. A few too many people sitting in parked cars. The same face appearing in different windows across the street. The unmistakable feeling of being watched by professionals. Viktor Kozlov was conducting surveillance, trying to understand what had happened to his men the night before. Dimitri had returned to him with a story that seemed impossible. A single woman had defeated 6 trained fighters without breaking a sweat. Viktor's first instinct was that his men were lying to cover their incompetence, but the medical evidence told a different story. The precision of their injuries suggested someone with advanced combat training. Sarah went about her morning routine as if nothing had happened, but her senses were heightened to combat levels. Every person who entered her gym was evaluated as a potential threat. Every sound from the street was analyzed for danger. She was back in the mental state that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments, but she couldn't let it show. Her first class was a group of college women who came every Tuesday and Thursday morning. They were bright, energetic young women studying at Arizona State University who wanted to learn basic self-defense before graduating and moving to new cities. Sarah treasured these classes because they reminded her why her work mattered.
Morning, Miss Martinez, called out Jessica, a sophomore studying journalism. You look different today. More intense?
Sarah forced herself to relax her shoulders and soften her expression.
Just didn't sleep well last night.
Let's start with our warm-up routine. As the class progressed, Sarah found herself teaching with a new urgency. These young women were exactly the type of people that Victor's organization would target: vulnerable, isolated from family, with limited resources to fight back. She began incorporating more advanced techniques into their basic curriculum, disguising combat-effective moves as simple self-defense exercises. Remember, she told them as they practiced escape techniques, if someone grabs you, your goal isn't to win a fight.
Your goal is to create an opportunity to get away. Speed and surprise are your greatest weapons.
After the class ended and her students left, Sarah noticed a black SUV parked across the street with its engine running. Through the tinted windows, she could make out at least two figures watching her building. She made a mental note of the vehicle's position and license plate while pretending to sweep the sidewalk in front of her gym.
Her phone rang just as she was heading back inside.
The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made her suspicious.
Phoenix Rising Gym, this is Sarah.
Ms. Martinez, came a smooth voice with a slight Russian accent.
My name is Viktor Kozlov. I believe you met some of my associates last night.
Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady.
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Please, do not insult my intelligence.
My men told me a very interesting story about their visit to your establishment.
I confess, I am curious to meet the woman who could handle 6 grown men so efficiently. If your men were hurt, maybe they should consider finding a different line of work. Victor's laugh was cold and calculating. I admire your spirit, Ms. Martinez. But I think you do not understand the situation you have created.
This is no longer about protection money. You have made this personal.
I didn't make anything personal, Sarah replied. Your men came into my business and threatened me.
I defended myself. If you want to escalate this situation, that's your choice. Indeed, it is my choice. And I choose to extend you one final courtesy.
Meet me tonight at the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard, Building 47.
Come alone, and we will discuss this like civilized people.
Refuse, and I will be forced to handle this matter in a way that will be very unpleasant for everyone involved. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She stared at her phone for a moment, processing the invitation. It was obviously a trap, but it was also an opportunity. Victor was confident enough in his abilities to meet her face to face, which meant he didn't yet understand what he was dealing with.
Sarah spent the rest of the day quietly preparing.
She canceled her afternoon classes and sent her regular students messages about unexpected maintenance issues. She used the time to research Viktor Kozlov's organization, calling in favors from old military contacts who had access to intelligence databases. What she learned was both helpful and concerning. Viktor Kozlov had been a Spetsnaz officer in the Russian military before his discharge. He was intelligent, ruthless, and experienced in both conventional combat and psychological warfare. His organization had been linked to human trafficking operations across 3 states, with a particular focus on targeting vulnerable women and immigrants who were unlikely to be missed by authorities. The warehouse he had chosen for their meeting was in an industrial area that would be deserted at night, surrounded by businesses that closed at 5 o'clock. It was perfect for an ambush, but it was also isolated enough that Sarah could operate without worrying about civilian casualties. As evening approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She dressed in dark clothing that would allow for maximum mobility, and she took inventory of the tools available to her. Unlike her attackers the night before, Victor would be expecting a fight, which meant she couldn't rely on the element of surprise.
At 9 o'clock, Sarah drove to the warehouse district.
She parked several blocks away from the meeting location and approached on foot, using skills she had learned in urban warfare training to move unseen through the shadows between buildings. The area was exactly as she had expected: dark, quiet, and perfect for an ambush. Building 47 was a large, converted warehouse with multiple entrances and very few windows.
Sarah spent 20 minutes conducting reconnaissance, identifying at least 8 men positioned around the building's perimeter. Victor had definitely not come alone, and he had definitely not come to talk. Sarah's military training had taught her that when walking into a trap, the key was to spring it on your own terms. She found a service entrance on the building's north side that was being watched by only one guard. Moving with the silent precision of a trained infiltrator, she neutralized the guard without raising an alarm and made her way into the building. The interior was a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment that had been arranged to create narrow corridors and blind corners. Perfect for an ambush, but also perfect for someone who knew how to use urban terrain to their advantage. Sarah moved through the space like a ghost, staying in the shadows and gathering intelligence about her opponent's positions. She found Victor waiting in the center of the warehouse, standing in a circle of bright light created by portable work lamps. He was a tall, imposing man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even alone and surrounded by potential danger, he projected confidence and control. "Ms. Martinez," he called out when he sensed her presence in the darkness around him. "I was beginning to think you had reconsidered my invitation." Sarah stepped into the light, keeping her hands visible but ready to move quickly if necessary. "I'm here. Let's talk." Victor studied her with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "You are not what I expected. You look like school teacher, not someone who could defeat my men." "Appearances can be deceiving." "Indeed they can. Tell me, Ms. Martinez, what is your background? Because I have been asking questions about you, and I find very few answers." "Your gym has been open for 2 years. Before that, you seem to have appeared from nowhere." Sarah felt a moment of gratitude for Colonel Hayes' assistance in burying her military records. "Some people value their privacy." "Privacy is luxury that costs money," Victor replied. "And, since you refuse to pay for protection, perhaps you can pay for privacy in other ways." "What do you want?" Victor began walking slowly around the circle of light, forcing Sarah to turn to keep him in sight. "I want to make you offer that benefits both of us. You have skills that could be very useful to my organization. Work for me, and I will forgive last night's unpleasantness." "What kind of work?" "Security. Training. Occasional enforcement when situations require delicate touch. You would be well compensated, and your little gym could continue operating under my protection." Sarah felt sick at the thought of using her skills to help an organization that trafficked human beings. "And if I refuse? Then, you become an obstacle that must be removed. But, I hope you will be reasonable. I have researched enough to know that you are not ordinary woman. Work with me, and I promise your talents will be properly appreciated." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, pretending to consider the offer while actually counting the number of men she could sense moving in the darkness around them. Victor had at least 12 people positioned throughout the warehouse, all of them armed and waiting for his signal. "I need to ask you something," she said finally. "The women your organization moves across state lines. What happens to them?" Victor's expression didn't change, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "That is not your concern. Actually, it is my concern. Because you see, I've made a career out of protecting people who can't protect themselves. And what you do to those women is exactly the kind of thing I've spent my life fighting against." "Then, you have chosen poorly," Victor said, raising his hand in a signal to his hidden men. What happened next was a masterpiece of tactical planning and execution that showcased exactly why Sarah had been one of the most effective SEALs in her unit. The moment Victor's hand went up, Sarah was already moving. She had spent her reconnaissance time not just locating her opponents, but also identifying the warehouse's electrical system. The lights went out all at once, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. In the confusion that followed, Victor's men found themselves fighting an opponent who could see in the dark and seemed to be everywhere at once. Sarah used the maze of containers and equipment to her advantage, appearing just long enough to neutralize a threat before disappearing back into the shadows. The fight was unlike anything Victor had ever experienced. His men were well trained and experienced, but
they had never faced an opponent with Sarah's particular combination of skills. She moved through their defensive positions like smoke, using techniques that came from years of training in the world's most advanced military special operations programs. One by one, Victor's men found themselves disabled by strikes that came from angles they hadn't anticipated, delivered with a precision that suggested extensive training in anatomy and pressure points. Sarah was careful to use only the force necessary to neutralize each threat, but she was also ruthless in her efficiency. Within 15 minutes, the warehouse was silent except for the groans of injured men and Victor's heavy breathing. Sarah had systematically dismantled his entire security team while remaining essentially invisible in the darkness. When the emergency lighting finally kicked in, Victor found himself alone in the circle of light, surrounded by his unconscious or immobilized men. Sarah materialized from the shadows like an avenging spirit, her clothing barely disheveled despite the intensity of the fight. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, his confidence finally cracking. Sarah walked slowly toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'm someone who spent 8 years learning how to eliminate threats to innocent people. I'm someone who has seen what men like you do to vulnerable women, and I'm someone who has the skills to stop you." Victor reached for the weapon concealed under his jacket, but Sarah was faster. She disarmed him with a move so quick and efficient that he barely saw it happening. The gun skittered across the concrete floor, well out of reach. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command in life or death situations. "You and your organization are going to leave Phoenix tonight. You're going to shut down your operations here and find somewhere else to conduct your business. You cannot be serious. Do you have any idea who I am? What resources I have available?" "I know exactly who you are, Victor. You're a former Spetsnaz officer who was discharged for excessive violence and decided to make a career out of trafficking human beings. You're smart, you're dangerous, and you have connections that reach across multiple states." Victor looked genuinely surprised that she had access to his background information. "But here's what you don't know about me," Sarah continued. "And that ignorance is going to save your life tonight. Because if you knew what I was really capable of, you wouldn't be standing here trying to negotiate. You'd be running as fast and as far as you could." She knelt down and picked up Victor's weapon, ejecting the magazine and clearing the chamber with practiced efficiency. "I'm giving you 12 hours to get out of Phoenix. Take your men, take your operations, and find somewhere else to set up shop." "And if I refuse?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen combat in 3 different war zones. "Then, I'll stop asking nicely." Victor looked around the warehouse at his defeated men, then back at Sarah. For the first time since their encounter began, he seemed to understand that he was completely out of his depth. "This is not over," he said finally. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied. "Because if I see you or any of your people in this city after tomorrow night, I won't be content with just sending you away. I'll make sure you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone again." As Victor helped his injured men to their feet and began the humiliating process of retreating from a fight he had been certain he would win, Sarah disappeared back into the shadows. She waited until she was sure they had all left before making her own exit from the warehouse. On the drive back to her gym, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. The adrenaline of combat was still coursing through her veins, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this victory had come at a cost. She had revealed more of her true capabilities than she had intended, and word of what happened tonight would spread through criminal networks across the state. But she had also accomplished something important. Victor's organization would leave Phoenix, which meant the vulnerable people they had been targeting would be safe, at least for now. Her students could continue coming to her classes without fear of being caught in the crossfire of a criminal war. As she pulled into the parking space behind her gym, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Well done, but this is only the beginning. Others will come. Be ready." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. She didn't know who had sent it or how they knew about what had happened tonight. But she did know one thing: her quiet life in Phoenix had just become much more complicated. That night, as she sat in her apartment above the gym, Sarah made a decision that would change the direction of her life. She opened her laptop and began reaching out to old contacts from her military days. If criminal organizations were going to start targeting her city, she needed to be prepared for a different kind of war than the one she had just won. The battle with Victor had been a test, and she had passed. But she had a feeling that much bigger challenges were coming. And, this time, she wouldn't be facing them alone. 3 weeks after Victor's organization fled Phoenix, Sarah thought she might have miscalculated the consequences of her actions. Life had returned to a comfortable routine. Her classes were fuller than ever, word having somehow spread that her gym was a safe place where women could learn real self-defense skills. She had even started teaching a special program for domestic violence survivors, working with local shelters to provide free training to women who needed it most. But the calm was deceptive. Sarah's military instincts told her that something was building just beyond her perception. The mysterious text message she had received the night of the warehouse confrontation had proven prophetic. Others were indeed coming, and they were taking much more time to study their target than Victor had. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in November. Sarah was opening her gym when she noticed a woman sitting in the coffee shop across the street, reading a newspaper and occasionally glancing in her direction. The woman was in her 30s with short blonde hair and the kind of casual clothing that suggested she belonged in the neighborhood. To most people, she would have been invisible. But Sarah noticed the way she held herself, the way her eyes moved, and the subtle bulge under her jacket that suggested a concealed weapon. Professional surveillance. Not the clumsy intimidation tactics that Victor's people had used, but the careful, patient observation of someone who understood the value of intelligence gathering. Sarah went about her morning routine, but she began implementing counter-surveillance measures that she hadn't used since her military days. She varied her routes to the grocery store. She changed her daily schedule randomly. She started paying attention to every detail of her environment with the intensity of someone operating in hostile territory. Her caution proved justified when she identified at least 6 different people conducting surveillance on her gym over the course of a week. They worked in shifts, never staying in one location too long, never making direct eye contact. These were professionals, and they were being very careful not to spook their target. On Friday afternoon, Sarah's patience with being watched finally ran out. After her last class ended, she decided to turn the tables and do some surveillance of her own. She had identified one of the watchers as a woman who worked out of a rented office space 3 blocks from her gym. Sarah used her knowledge of urban terrain to approach the building unseen and conducted reconnaissance that would have impressed her old SEAL instructors. What she discovered was deeply troubling. The office space was being used as a command center for a surveillance operation that was much larger than she had imagined. Through carefully positioned windows, Sarah could see multiple computer monitors, surveillance equipment, and wall charts that appeared to be tracking her movements and daily routine with military precision. But what worried her most was the quality of the operation. This wasn't being run by street criminals or even typical organized crime figures. The equipment, the methodology, and the level of organization suggested government resources or high-level private military contractors. That evening, Sarah made a phone call that she had been hoping to avoid. Colonel Rebecca Hayes answered on the second ring, as if she had been expecting the call. "Martinez, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. I take it Phoenix isn't as quiet as you hoped?" "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any chance that what happened with Viktor Kozlov's organization attracted attention from federal agencies?" There was a long pause before the colonel responded. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm under surveillance by people who have resources and training that go way beyond local criminals. This operation looks governmental. Martinez, I'm going to share something with you that's classified, and I'm only doing it because I owe you for everything you did overseas. About 6 months ago, several federal agencies became aware of a new threat, foreign criminal organizations that are specifically targeting former military personnel who have disappeared into civilian life." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of targeting? Recruitment, blackmail, elimination?" "The theory is that foreign intelligence services are trying to identify and either control or neutralize former special operations personnel who might pose a threat to their activities on American soil.
And Victor's organization was probably connected to this network, though they may not have known it at the time.
When you dismantled their Phoenix operation so efficiently, you sent a signal through criminal and intelligence networks that there's a former special operator in your area who still has her skills. Sarah closed her eyes, understanding the full implications of what the colonel was telling her.
So the surveillance team isn't law enforcement. They're trying to figure out exactly what my capabilities are so they can decide whether to try to recruit me or eliminate me. That's my assessment. And Martinez? These people are very good at what they do. They've successfully compromised several former operators in other cities. Some took money and disappeared into foreign intelligence networks. Others refused and were found dead under circumstances that look like accidents or random crimes. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment, processing the reality of her situation. Her choice to fight Victor had exposed her to dangers that she couldn't handle with the same tactics she had used against local criminals. This was a different kind of war, one that required different strategies and different allies. The next morning brought clarity in the form of a formal introduction.
Sarah was teaching her early morning self-defense class when a tall woman with short gray hair and sharp intelligence in her eyes walked into her gym. The woman waited patiently until the class ended, then approached Sarah with the confidence of someone accustomed to command.
Ms. Martinez, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Chen. I represent an organization that has been following your recent activities with great interest. I wonder if we could speak privately. Sarah evaluated the woman quickly. She was clearly not one of the surveillance team, and her manner suggested academic rather than operational background. But there was also something about her that felt trustworthy in a way that Sarah couldn't quite define. What kind of organization?
The kind that helps former military personnel navigate situations that fall between the civilian world and the world you left behind when you got out of the service. They met that afternoon at a small restaurant on the outskirts of Phoenix where Dr. Chen explained the true nature of Sarah's situation. The organization she represented was a classified federal program that had been developed in response to the growing threat of foreign intelligence services targeting former American Special Operations personnel. What Viktor Kozlov didn't know, Dr. Chen explained over coffee, was that his organization was receiving funding and guidance from a Russian intelligence network that has been operating in the United States for several years. When you eliminated his Phoenix operations so effectively, you disrupted a much larger plan. Which was to establish a network of criminal organizations across the American Southwest that could be used for intelligence gathering, money laundering, and personnel recruitment. Your victory over Victor saved countless potential victims, but it also made you a target for people who have resources that go far beyond anything you faced as a SEAL. Dr. Chen showed Sarah photographs and documents that painted a picture of a sophisticated intelligence operation. Russian, Chinese, and Iranian networks were all competing to identify and either recruit or eliminate former American Special Operations personnel who were living civilian lives. They're particularly interested in people like you, Dr. Chen continued. Former SEALs who have the skills to train others and who have chosen to work with civilian populations. You represent both an opportunity and a threat to their operations. So what are you offering me? Protection, support, and, most importantly, a chance to continue doing what you're doing while helping us identify and neutralize these foreign networks. We want you to keep running your gym, keep teaching your classes, but also help us turn the tables on the people who are hunting former operators like yourself. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything about her life in Phoenix. She agreed to work with Dr. Chen's organization, but on her own terms. She would continue running her gym and teaching her classes, but she would also begin training a select group of people who could help defend their community against threats that law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle. The surveillance team watching her gym had no idea that their target had just become the center of a much larger operation. Over the next week, Sarah began implementing Dr. Chen's plan while maintaining the appearance of normal civilian life. She started by identifying potential allies among her students and neighbors. Jessica, the journalism student, had originally come to her classes because she was investigating human trafficking networks for a senior project. Maria, a former Army medic who attended her advanced classes, had been looking for a way to use her military skills in civilian life. David, who owned the coffee shop across the street, was a former Marine who had been wondering why his neighborhood had suddenly become so interesting to people with expensive cars and surveillance equipment. Sarah began having quiet conversations with each of them, feeling out their willingness to become involved in something that was bigger than self-defense classes. What she found was a community of people who had been looking for exactly the kind of purpose that she was offering. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had assembled a team of 7 people who combined military experience, local knowledge, and specialized skills that would prove invaluable in the fight ahead. They met in the back room of her gym after hours, planning and training for confrontations that none of them fully understood yet. The surveillance team watching Sarah finally made their move on a cold December evening. They had apparently concluded that she was indeed a former special operations soldier, but they had seriously underestimated both her current capabilities and the support network she had been building. 3 cars pulled up to her gym at closing time, deploying a team of 8 operatives who moved with the precision of people who had done this many times before. They expected to find a single target who could be overwhelmed by superior numbers and professional tactics. Instead, they found themselves walking into a trap that had been designed by someone who understood exactly how such operations worked. Sarah and her team had been watching the Watchers for 2 weeks, learning their patterns and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The fight was brief and decisive. Sarah's new allies performed exactly as she had trained them, using the terrain and tactics that turned her gym into a fortress rather than a trap. When it was over, the surveillance team found themselves zip-tied on the floor while Sarah and her people gathered intelligence that would prove invaluable to Dr. Chen's larger operation. "Who sent you?" Sarah asked the team leader, a woman who had been posing as a graduate student for the past month. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," the woman replied. "This operation is bigger than you can imagine." "Then, help me understand it," Sarah said calmly. "Because I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not stopping what I'm doing. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate with us or continue to be our enemy." What happened next surprised everyone in the room. The woman, whose name turned out to be Anna Volkov, began to cry. Not from physical pain, but from something that looked like relief. "They have my sister," she said finally. "They recruited me 3 years ago by threatening to kill her if I didn't cooperate. I've been looking for a way out ever since." Sarah and Dr. Chen spent the next 2 hours listening to Anna's story and learning about the true scope of the network they were fighting. What they discovered was both more dangerous and more vulnerable than they had imagined. The foreign intelligence network was indeed vast and well-funded, but it was also dependent on coercion and fear to maintain control over its operatives. Many of the people working for them were like Anna, trapped by threats against their families rather than truly committed to the cause. By the end of the evening, Sarah had gained not just intelligence about her enemies, but also the beginning of a network of allies who were working within the system she was fighting against. Anna agreed to become a double agent, feeding information back to Dr. Chen's organization while appearing to continue her surveillance mission. "This is just the beginning," Dr. Chen told Sarah as they watched Anna's team leave with new instructions and hidden communication devices. "What you've accomplished tonight is going to change the balance of power in this entire operation." Sarah looked around her gym, where her students would return the next morning expecting to learn basic self-defense techniques. They had no idea that their quiet neighborhood gym had become the center of an intelligence war that stretched across multiple countries and affected the safety of former military personnel throughout the American Southwest. But Sarah was no longer fighting this battle alone. She had allies, resources, and, most importantly, a mission that gave her life the same sense of purpose that had driven her through 3 combat deployments. The only difference was that this time, she was fighting to protect her own community rather than serving in a foreign country. As she locked up her gym that night, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since Viktor Kozlov's men first walked through her door. She had thought she was retiring from the war. Instead, she had just brought the war home, where she could fight it on her own terms with people she cared about. The real battle was just beginning, but, for the first time since Marcus's death, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after Anna Volkov became a double agent, Sarah's quiet neighborhood gym had transformed into the nerve center of the most successful counterintelligence operation that Dr.
Chen's organization had ever conducted.
From the outside, Phoenix Rising still looked like a simple self-defense studio where local women learned to protect themselves. But, beneath the surface, it had become something much more significant. The intelligence that Anna provided had led to the identification and dismantling of foreign recruitment networks in 7 major American cities. Sarah's team had grown from 7 local allies to a coordinated network of former military personnel, law enforcement officers, and civilians who were all committed to protecting their communities from threats that existed in the shadows between crime and espionage. But, success had come with a price. The foreign intelligence services that had been targeting former American operatives had begun to understand that their recruitment operations were being systematically destroyed by someone with extensive knowledge of both their methods and their personnel. They had started adapting their tactics, becoming more violent and more desperate as their networks were exposed. The first serious escalation came on a warm April morning when Sarah arrived at her gym to find that someone had attempted to break in during the night. The attempt had been thwarted by the security system that Dr. Chen's organization had installed, but the message was clear: Sarah's enemies were getting bolder and more aggressive.
"They're moving to direct action," Dr. Chen explained during their secure video call that afternoon.
Anna's reports indicate that her handlers are becoming suspicious of the intelligence failures they've been experiencing.
They're starting to suspect that someone within their organization is compromising their operations.
Sarah felt a chill of concern for Anna, who had risked everything to help them over the past 6 months. The young Russian woman had become more than just a source of intelligence. She had become a friend whose courage and determination reminded Sarah of her fallen comrade Marcus.
How much longer can Anna maintain her cover? Not long.
We're already making preparations to extract her and her sister from the network. But that means losing our most valuable source of inside information at a time when we need it most.
What do you mean? Dr. Chen's expression grew grim on the video screen.
Anna's latest intelligence indicates that the Russian network is planning something they're calling Resolution Protocol.
It's designed to permanently eliminate the threat that you and your operation represent to their activities. Meaning?
Meaning they're going to try to kill everyone involved in our network, starting with you and working their way down the chain until they've eliminated anyone who knows enough to threaten their operations. That evening, Sarah called a meeting of her core team in the secure room behind her gym. Jessica, the former journalism student who had become their intelligence analyst, Maria, the former army medic who had developed their medical and tactical support protocols, David, the Marine veteran who ran counter-surveillance from his coffee shop, and, for others who had proven themselves over months of dangerous operations. "We have a problem," Sarah began, then laid out the situation as Dr. Chen had explained it.
"The people we've been fighting have decided that the only way to protect their operations is to eliminate all of us permanently."
The silence that followed was broken by Maria, whose calm voice reflected the steadiness that had made her an excellent combat medic.
"So what are our options?"
"We can scatter," Sarah said.
Dr. Chen's organization can provide new identities and relocation assistance for everyone.
We disappear, start over somewhere else, and hope they don't find us.
Or, asked David. Or we end this. Permanently. Jessica looked up from the intelligence reports she had been reviewing. Anna's information includes details about the leadership of the Russian network. If we could neutralize the command structure, their entire American operation would collapse. That would be an act of war, David pointed out. We're talking about assassinating foreign intelligence officers on American soil.
Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Marcus and the promise they had made to each other about protecting innocent people. What we're talking about is defending our community against people who traffic in human beings, recruit through coercion and murder, and who are now planning to kill us and everyone we care about. But, if we do this, Maria said, there's no going back to normal civilian life.
We become something else entirely. Haven't we already become something else? Sarah asked. When I started this, I thought I was just defending my gym from local criminals.
Now we're part of an intelligence war that affects the safety of every former service member trying to build a civilian life. The discussion continued for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. They had come too far and learned too much to simply disappear and hope for the best. The Russian network had made the decision to escalate to lethal force, which meant that Sarah and her team had to be prepared to respond in kind. Dr. Chen was not happy when Sarah informed her of their decision the next morning. "What you're proposing goes far beyond the mandate of my organization. If you proceed with this operation, you'll be acting as private citizens without official support or protection." "Then, that's what we'll do," Sarah replied. "These people made it personal when they decided to hunt down and murder former American soldiers. I'm not going to run and hide while they continue their operations." "Sarah, I understand your feelings, but you need to think about the consequences. If this operation goes wrong, my organization won't be able to protect you from legal or political fallout." "Dr. Chen, with all due respect, your organization asked me to help identify and neutralize foreign intelligence networks." "That's exactly what I'm proposing to do, just more permanently than you might prefer." 3 days later, Anna made contact with Sarah through their established secure communication system. Her message was brief but urgent, they know. Extraction window closing. Resolution protocol activated for this weekend. Sarah immediately activated the emergency protocols that her team had spent months developing. Within 6 hours, every member of her network had disappeared into safe houses and defensive positions throughout Phoenix. Anna and her sister were extracted from the Russian network by a team that Maria had assembled, using skills and contacts that she had developed during her military service. But the most important preparation was the intelligence that Anna had provided about the location and timing of the Russian leadership meeting that was scheduled to finalize the resolution protocol. Sarah now knew exactly when and where she could find the people who had been hunting her and her allies. The meeting was set to take place at a private estate on the outskirts of Scottsdale that was owned by a Russian businessman who served as a front for intelligence operations. According to Anna's information, 3 senior intelligence officers would be present, along with the operational commanders who had been directing the network's American activities. Sarah spent 2 days conducting reconnaissance on the estate, identifying security measures, guard rotations, and potential infiltration routes. What she found was a property that was well protected against casual intrusion but not prepared for the kind of assault that someone with her background could conduct. On Saturday night, as the Russian leadership team gathered to plan the elimination of her network, Sarah implemented an operation that showcased every skill she had learned during 8 years as a Navy SEAL. She approached the estate alone, using the darkness and terrain to remain undetected by the external security team. Her infiltration of the property itself was a masterpiece of stealth and precision that would have impressed her old instructors. She moved through the grounds like a shadow, neutralizing security measures and gathering intelligence about the meeting in progress. What she found in the estate's main conference room was exactly what Anna's intelligence had predicted: 5 men planning the systematic murder of everyone connected to Sarah's operation. The conversation was being conducted in Russian, but Sarah's military language training allowed her to understand enough to confirm the details of their plan. They intended to begin with coordinated attacks on her team members' homes and businesses the following morning. Sarah herself was to be eliminated last, after being forced to watch the destruction of everyone she had worked with over the past months. It was psychological warfare designed to send a message to any other former military personnel who might be tempted to interfere with their operations. Sarah had heard enough. She moved into position and began implementing the final phase of her plan. What happened next was swift, precise, and decisive. Sarah had not come to the estate to capture or interrogate her enemies. She had come to permanently eliminate a threat to innocent people, and she executed that mission with the cold efficiency that had made her one of the most effective operators in her SEAL unit. When it was over, the Russian intelligence network that had been terrorizing former American military personnel across the Southwest ceased to exist as a functional organization. Sarah had eliminated not just the leadership team, but also the operational infrastructure that supported their activities. She left no evidence of her presence at the estate, and the deaths would eventually be attributed to an internal power struggle within Russian organized crime networks. Dr. Chen's organization would deny any knowledge of the operation, and Anna would provide corroborating intelligence to support the official explanation. But Sarah's war was not over. As she drove back toward Phoenix in the early morning hours, she received a secure message from contacts in other cities reporting that similar foreign intelligence networks were operating across the country. The Russian network had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle. By sunrise, Sarah was back in her gym, preparing for her Monday morning self-defense classes as if nothing had happened. Her students arrived expecting to learn basic martial arts techniques and personal safety skills. They had no idea that their instructor had spent the weekend eliminating threats that could have affected the safety of former military personnel throughout the American Southwest. Jessica arrived early that morning with a cup of coffee and an intelligence report about potential Chinese network activities in California. Maria came by to discuss medical supply acquisitions that could support operations in urban environments. David stopped by to review security protocols for the coffee shop that continued to serve as their observation post. "So what's next?" Jessica asked as they gathered in the back room after the last class of the day. Sarah looked around at the faces of people who had become more than allies or students, they had become family. "Next, we expand our mission. Dr. Chen's organization is good at identifying threats and gathering intelligence, but they're limited by bureaucracy and political considerations. We're not. Meaning? Meaning we become what our communities need us to be. We protect former military personnel who are trying to build civilian lives. We eliminate threats that law enforcement and federal agencies can't or won't address. We make sure that people like Viktor Kozlov and the Russian intelligence network don't get the chance to hurt innocent people." Maria nodded slowly. "We become something that doesn't officially exist, but that does what needs to be done." Exactly. That night, as Sarah sat in her apartment above the gym where she had first decided to fight back against Viktor's organization, she thought about Marcus and the promise they had made to each other. She had thought that promise died with him in Afghanistan. Instead, it had evolved into something bigger and more important than either of them could have imagined. Her phone buzzed with a secure message from a former SEAL in Denver who was dealing with a situation that sounded very familiar. Sarah smiled as she began typing her response. Phoenix Rising Gym was about to get its first satellite location, and the network that had begun with one woman defending her small business was about to become something much more significant. The war for America's communities was expanding, and Sarah Martinez was no longer fighting it alone. She had built something that could protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and she had proven that sometimes the most effective way to eliminate a threat was to attack it with the same ruthlessness that it brought to its victims. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reflected on how far she had traveled from the broken, guilt-ridden veteran who had moved to Phoenix seeking peace and anonymity. She hadn't found peace, but she had found something more valuable, a purpose that honored both her fallen friend and her own capabilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new threats, but it would also bring new opportunities to protect innocent people and eliminate those who preyed on them. Sarah Martinez was no longer hiding from her past as a Navy SEAL. She was using every skill she had learned in service to her country to protect the communities that she had chosen to defend. The student had become the teacher, and the teacher had become something that her enemies would learn to fear. In the quiet neighborhoods of Phoenix and beyond, a network of protectors was growing that would ensure the safety of people who had earned the right to live their lives without fear. Phoenix Rising had become more than just a gym. It had become a symbol of resistance against those who threatened the innocent, and a promise that some battles would be fought by people who understood the true cost of freedom and were willing to pay it again and again. The resolution protocol had failed, and a new kind of warfare had begun. Sarah Martinez and her allies were ready for whatever came next.